Who were the collaborators with the Germans in say in the Balkans during the Holocaust?
Unfortunately, a lot of the various other ethnic groups were involved. Surprisingly, in Greece, in Salonika per se, the Asia Minor refugee immigrants who came in the 20s, they were hostile to the Jews. But they weren't the major collaborators with the Nazis. Unfortunately, the major collaborators with the Nazis were Ponts and Armenians. And they got away with it. And they never were hunted down afterward. Greece did have war trials, and none of the Armenians were ever found. And the Armenians, unfortunately, have a very dark history in the Holocaust. They had 2 pro-Nazi units, and it's even, in terms of other minority groups, in Bosnia in particular, the Muslims, fueled by the Mufti of Jerusalem, carried out a lot of the genocide against the Jews in Bosnia, former Yugoslavia. As you know, also the Mufti had formed 2 pro-Nazi units. He also was involved in exacerbating pro-Nazi riots against the Jews in Iraq, in particular in Baghdad, where 180 Jews died in what was called the Farhud in June 1941, as the British just stood by and didn't do anything. And there's a woman in Washington, D.C. named Flori Jagoda, who sings Judeo-Spanish songs. And 30-some members of her family in a small village were stuffed into a barn by the local Muslims and burned to death. And so this is the side of the Holocaust that we don't see. You had the Serbs, who also were involved in annihilation of Jews in Serbia. You had the Croatians who first exploited the Jews. They devoted their efforts in the Jasenovic's death camp first to destroying the Jews. They kept 40-some Jews alive, and then they killed maybe 750,000 Serbs. And by Holocaust deniers, those Jews who remained in the camp and had minor functions in forced labor, they're blamed for being responsible for the annihilation of the Serbs, as opposed to Serbs blaming the Croatians. And unfortunately, my fellow scholars of the Holocaust in the 90s didn't see any importance to put the Balkans on the agenda. They had special workshops in England about all sorts of issues of genocide, but I was rejected to have to lead a workshop on the Balkans. So there was no, in the 90s, there was no real report to the genocide in the East. I mean, this is the sick man of Europe. He doesn't rate. It's not on the radar screen. And more people talk about Rwanda in the lessons and in Darfur even than what happened in the Balkans. But it's also a symptom of a distorted view that the West has toward the East. And in the Balkans you have vehement ethnic and religious conflicts which aren't going to go away, and which will be revived. And it's just blindness. And why does the world only focus on what Germany and Poland did? What the Serbs did against the Croatians and what the Croatians did against the Serbs is a terrible thing. And historically it involved hundreds of millions of people. And it's a source of conflict. So why does not that issue rate? Because it's the West doesn't want to deal with it. And in Bosnia there was a Dutch unit of the UN that actually left their posts and allowed the killing to go on. So at that point...
during World War II?
No, in 1990, in the 90s, like
right,
in 93, 95, I don't remember exactly. Okay?
How many Jews outside of Europe died in the Holocaust? I mean, we hear about the 6 million, and we assume they're all in Europe.
No, in terms of numbers, it's very small. But it's also because we're only talking about a few thousand, but it's only because the war was very short. In other words, the Allies, primarily the British, succeeded in thwarting the Germans in North Africa. But in Tunisia, for example, you only had Nazi occupation for 5 months. But the issue isn't in terms of absolute numbers what happened, because it's minuscule in terms of compared to 3 million Jews of Poland being killed in the Holocaust. But if you have tens of Jews in many camps being killed in forced labor, that's part of the Holocaust. Because in Denmark, you think that everyone is righteous, but there were 400 Jews who were deported, and some of them died, and some of them were betrayed by the Danish people. The biggest incident was in Chado, in Libya, where the Italians, who were the rescuers and altruistic, in the Balkans, they led 611 people to their death in a labor camp. And the Italians are even worse than the Germans in terms of reparations. They only started giving reparations in 1985, and they really give survivors a hard time when they're making applications. And that hasn't been scrutinized by the world. It hasn't been scrutinized by the Jewish world. Because also, that's a population that, it's out of the radar screen. They're not exactly Ashkenazi, so they don't know how to relate to them.
There's been controversy over the past 20 years about Israel pushing... Is it Israel pushing Turkey to recognize the genocide against the Armenians?
As I said, it's an extremely loaded issue. The Ottoman scholars have a different view of it, more as a perennial conflict. And Turkey's been tricked many times. That's more the issue. Like, I'll give you an example in Israel what happened. The first Turkish ambassador to Israel, his name was Kerem, very nice guy. You know, by the fact that he was in Israel, he became more Jewish and more pro-Israel than, Turkey would have liked, and all that kind of stuff. But, so he went on TV in a show about the Armenian genocide, and he was going to give it an official response, which was sanctioned by the Turkish government. So by the Freudenstick, by the chicanery of the editors, and including some Armenian influences, he said, he basically wanted to say it's time that Turkey's going to, reconcile with this, and as time goes on, Turkey, acknowledges more and more its role in what happened. So, and he talked about when he was in Washington, he was very sensitive to the Jewish Holocaust. So, what did the editors do? They twisted his words. They said, not only isn't there an Armenian Holocaust, but there isn't a Jewish Holocaust. This was on Israeli TV on Friday night. Turkey almost broke off diplomatic relations with Israel at that point.
When was this?
This was like in the early 80s. All right? The Armenians have knocked off over 40 diplomats.
Turkish diplomats?
Yeah. Okay. And there's a scholar in Minnesota who's a Turk who, totally sympathizes with the Armenians and is critical of Turkey. But there's a middle road. And the problem is when you have these scholars who twist the reality. And that's where the friction starts. Because in our Ottoman scholars group, you have these people who've come, and we even pressed for the Turkish archives to be open and open to these people. And then they come, and then they make up things, and they twist things. And there's one known one, a young guy in Germany, and there's a group of about 4 or 5. Okay, so instead of having a genuine dialogue of what happened, it becomes overly politicized. The problem is that it's extremely loaded, the question, and it's not one incident in 1915. And from what happened in 1893 to 1895, it was a blatant genocide. The Armenians the extremist groups tried to overthrow the Sultan 6 times. So, like a bully, Turkey